My 6-year subdirector was diverting donor funds to his personal account. I found out when a foreign donor asked about a program that did not exist in our records. What I found threatened everything we had built. There are betrayals that do not only affect you, that affect the people your work exists to serve, that use as their vehicle something that was built from a genuinely good place of wanting to do right. In the social sector, there is a specific category of harm that occurs when someone uses an organization's mission as cover for something that completely contradicts that mission. They do not only steal money, they steal trust. The trust of donors who believed their money was going where it said it was going. The trust of beneficiary people who deserve the resources that never arrived. The trust of the team that built something real without knowing there was a layer that did not correspond to what they thought they were building. My subdirector had done that for at least 2 years. And I found out because a woman in Sweden took the time to write an email asking about the results of a program that, according to her, she had financed. My name is Adriana. I am 43 years old. I am the director of Mujeres en Paz, a nonprofit organization that works with women victims of domestic violence in 3 states of the country, and that in 6 years had grown from 4 people to 22, and from an operating budget of 200,000 pesos annually to nearly 4 million. That growth had been possible in part because of the work I did, and in part because of the work Rodrigo did. Rodrigo was 46 years old. He was my subdirector. He had been with the organization for 6 years, since the beginning. He was the person who managed international donor relations, impact reports, and operational financial administration. He was, in the internal map of the organization, the person I trusted most for the part 1 could not manage alone. Ingrid's email arrived on a Wednesday morning. Ingrid Larsson, programs coordinator of a Swedish foundation that had been one of our most consistent donors for 3 years. Her email was cordial. It said they were doing an internal evaluation of their programs in Latin America and wanted to receive updated information about the results of the rural legal accompaniment program we had implemented with their funds over the past year. I sat looking at that email for a moment. Rural Legal Accompaniment Program. There was no program with that name in our organization. I replied to Ingrid telling her I was reviewing the information and would get back to her shortly. I closed the email. I searched our internal records for any reference to that program. Nothing. I searched the activity reports from the last 12 months. Nothing. I searched the project management system. Nothing. I called 2 coordinators who had been with the organization longer to ask whether they remembered any program with that name. Both told me no. I called Rodrigo on his cell phone. I asked him whether he knew what the Rural Legal Accompaniment Program was. There was a pause. He told me yes, that it was a program he had been developing with funds from the Swedish Foundation, that it was still in design phase, and he had not formally registered it in the system because operations had not begun. I asked him why the donor had records of having financed it if operations had not yet begun. Another pause. He told me he had received advance funds for the startup. I asked him when that money had come in and why it did not appear in our accounts. The pause that followed was the longest. He told me there had been a problem with the bank transfer, and he was resolving it. I told him I needed him to come to the office that day. He told me he was in the field. I told him tomorrow first thing. That afternoon, I did not wait until tomorrow. I accessed the organization's banking system with my own credentials. I reviewed the movements of the last 24 months. What I found over the next 2 hours was the most painful work of my 6 years as director. There were incoming transfers from a Swedish foundation corresponding to an amount Ingrid had described as the program's funding. Those transfers had arrived in our account. And in the days following each transfer, there were outgoing payments to supplier accounts I did not recognize. I searched those suppliers in our contract records. They did not exist in any formal record of the organization. I searched their tax information in the public registry. 2 of them did not exist as registered legal entities. One existed as a company, but its business purpose was construction materials importing, not social services, not legal consulting, not anything that made sense in the context of our organization. I kept reviewing. I did not limit myself to the Swedish Foundation's funding. I reviewed all movements from the last 2 years. I found the same pattern with 3 other funding sources. Funds arriving from donors. Outgoing payments in the following days to suppliers that did not correspond to any real record of the organization. For funding sources, a consistent pattern, a total amount that, when I calculated it, produced a physical sensation I had not expected. Approximately 850,000 pesos over 2 years. I called our external auditor that same afternoon. Her name was Carmen, and she had been doing the organization's annual audits for 4 years. I described what I had found. She told me what I was describing required an urgent forensic audit before any additional move, that I needed to not alter any records, that I needed to contact a criminal law attorney to guide me on the correct process before confronting Rodrigo, that if I confronted him before having the legal process clear, he could get ahead of it and destroy evidence or prepare a defense that would make subsequent actions more difficult. I told her I understood, that I would do it. The forensic audit took 1 week. What it determined was consistent with what I had found and more detailed. Rodrigo had created 3 fictitious companies using real people's data without their knowledge. He had generated invoices from those companies for services that had never been rendered. He had processed the payments using his access as the organization's financial administrator. The funds ended up in accounts the forensic audit connected to him through secondary transfers. The scheme had been operating for 2 years and 3 months. The total amount diverted was 872,000 pesos. The confrontation with Rodrigo occurred with my attorney present and with the complete documentation on the table. I'm not going to describe that conversation in detail because it is part of an active legal process. What I will say is what I feel is important to say. Rodrigo did not deny it when he saw the audit. He told me he had had personal debts, that he had started thinking he was going to pay it back, that he had continued because it was easier to continue than to stop, that he knew what he was doing to the organization, that he knew what it did to the women we served, that he had rationalized it in ways he now saw for what they were. I did not respond to any of that, not because I had nothing to say, but because in that moment what I said no longer mattered. What mattered was the legal process and what the organization was going to do next. What followed was a reconstruction period that has not yet ended. The legal process is ongoing. The affected donors were contacted in a direct and honest way. All of them, including Ingrid. The conversation with each donor was among the most difficult I have had because it meant telling people who had trusted us that that trust had been partially betrayed by someone in our organization. Most responded with a generosity I did not expect. Ingrid told me that what mattered was how we handled what had happened and not only what had happened. That the transparency with which we were communicating, it was in itself evidence of the kind of organization we were. Those words sustained me during the hardest weeks of that period. We implemented controls that did not exist before. Separation of functions between whoever approves expenses and whoever processes them. Mandatory supplier verification in the tax registry before any payment. Quarterly audit by the external auditor instead of annual. Board of Directors access to account statements in real time. Those controls did not exist before because we had grown organically and trust had substituted structure. That substitution had been the space where the scheme operated. What cost me most of this entire process was not the money or the legal process or the conversations with donors. It was processing what it meant that Rodrigo, who had been at the origin of the organization, who had helped build something genuinely valuable, had made those decisions. Not abstractly, specifically. There had been women who had not received legal accompaniment they would have received if the funds had reached where they were supposed to reach. That is not a number in a balance sheet. Those are people, and that is what still weighs on me when I think about what happened. What I want to take from this story has parts for 2 very specific audiences. For those who lead social or nonprofit organizations, trusting your team is necessary and valuable. And financial controls are not evidence of distrust. They are the structure that protects the organization's mission when trust fails. Separation of functions between whoever approves and whoever processes payments. Supplier verification before any disbursement. Access by the board of directors or supervisory body to financial information in real time. Those controls are basic and in many small and medium organizations do not exist because growth was faster than institutionalization. Institutionalizing them before needing them is always easier than doing it after a crisis. For donors of any kind, you have the right and the responsibility to ask about the specific results of the programs you fund, not as distrust of the organizations, as part of the accountability process that makes the sector function well. A question like Ingrid's can seem bureaucratic. It can also, as in this case, be what stops a scheme that would otherwise have continued. If this story impacted you, comment. Do you think the social organization sector has sufficient controls to prevent this type of fraud, or does trust continue to be the main control mechanism? Like if you believe financial transparency in nonprofit organizations is as important as the impact of their work. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who works in the social sector or who donates to organizations and who might benefit from knowing the basic controls that should exist. Practical tip. If you're a donor to a nonprofit organization, you have the right to request specific reports on the programs you fund with budget execution details. If the organization cannot or will not provide you that information, it is a warning sign. Serious organizations have those reports available and share them with their donors without it being necessary to ask insistently.